The sound still echoes in my mind, even after so many years. It wasn't the sound of military boots crunching on the wooden floor, nor the screams that followed. None of that. The sound that stuck in my memory was a soft but deep chant, which seemed to fill the space of the cold, impossible cell, where no human voice should enter. But before we get to that, we need to understand how it all began. My name is Murat. For many years I was a pastor in Andian, a small town in eastern Uzbekistan, where summer melts the asphalt and winter cuts through skin like glass. Being Christian, there was not only rare, but dangerous. It was considered a betrayal of the state, a betrayal of our culture, a betrayal of everything that defined our identity. So we were forced to live in the shadows, as if our faith was something to be hidden. We had no church. There was no sign of our presence, no signs, no bells, no trace of our existence. Just 15 people scattered across different houses, meeting secretly, always changing addresses, always fleeing. Chamila, a 60-year-old woman with hands calloused from hard work in the cotton fields, sheltered us in her kitchen on Tuesdays. Rustam, a mechanic with 3 young children, welcomed us into his damp basement on Thursdays. Dilbar, a young math teacher, opened the doors to her apartment on Sunday nights, but on one condition. We had to leave before dawn, without leaving a trace. We had codes. A knock on the window signaled that all was well. 2 quick knocks signaled imminent danger. No one carried Bibles in plain sight. We hid them in shopping bags, among vegetables and bread, as if they were just merchandise. Our prayers were low, barely audible, and we tried not to raise our hands too much in case someone looked through the window. But despite all this caution, we knew we weren't invisible. The National Security Service was always watching us. Uzbekistan is a place where the government controls everything related to religion. Preaching without official authorization is considered extremism. I've been interrogated twice. The first time I spent hours locked in a windowless room. The same question was repeated over and over. Who are the people attending your meetings? I didn't say a single name, not a single word. The second time they showed me photos, blurry images of us entering Yamila's house. One of the agents, with a gray mustache and an icy stare, slid the photos across the table and said, "We know where you are. We know when you're there. It's only a matter of time." Those words stayed with me, haunted me. Every time I walked the streets of Andian, I felt like someone was watching me. Every car parked near the house where we gathered felt like a threat, but I couldn't run away. Not yet. These people needed a place where they could be themselves, where they could talk to God without fear of reprisal. And I was the only pastor left in town. Living that way was like walking on brittle ice, never knowing when it would give way. Every day I woke up, I wondered if this would be my last day of freedom. Still, I couldn't stop. Every time I saw Rustam carrying his youngest son with that hopeful smile, or when I saw Dilbar with his eyes closed, tears streaming down his face as he prayed, I knew this was greater than my fear. Our faith, our need to be together was worth far more than any risk. And amidst the constant fear, something in my heart told me that, no matter what, being there was what I was meant to do. These people had found something worth risking everything for. And I knew I was the only one who could guide them on that path. But fear never completely disappears. It settles there, deep in the pit of my stomach, like a cold, constant weight. There were nights when sleep simply wouldn't come, because my mind would wander to the worst-case scenarios, the sound of doors opening, the footsteps that would herald the end. I wondered if I had the courage to stand firm, to protect those who trusted me. Would my fellow believers remember me as someone brave, or as someone who led them straight into a trap? I especially remember one night, just a few weeks before everything fell apart. We were in Dilbar's cramped apartment, a simple space on the 3rd floor of an old building, with walls so thin we could hear our neighbors' conversations. As we read Psalm 27, we heard heavy footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped right at the door to our hiding place. We held our breath. Rustam blew out the candle that illuminated the room. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. The footsteps continued, ascending to the next floor, and didn't come after us. But that night wasn't easy. No one spoke after that. We just held hands in the darkness and prayed silently until it was safe to breathe again. This was our life, an endless series of scares, of heavy hearts, of doors that could open at any moment, and at any moment, it could all end. But even amid this constant fear, there were also moments of light. I fondly remember the day Assista showed up at one of our meetings for the first time. He was shaking, not just from the cold, but from a deep, desperate sadness. "I've lost everything," he said weakly. "My wife, my children, my dignity." He asked if there was anything there for him. We welcomed him, prayed for him. And a few weeks later, I saw the transformation before my eyes. The light shone again in his face. He stopped drinking and began to rebuild his life. These are the miracles we experience hidden away from the eyes of the world. Then came the harsh December, with its biting cold and the streets of Andijan covered in dirty snow that barely protected us from the biting wind. That week, our meeting would be in Rustam's basement, a damp place that smelled of motor oil and icy concrete. There were only 12 of us. 3 were absent. Jamila was sick, and 2 other brothers didn't come for fear of being followed. Still, we knelt on the cold ground and began to pray. Rustam led the service in a low voice, almost a whisper. Dilbar held a battered Bible, his fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from something else, a foreboding. I closed my eyes and asked God for protection, wisdom, and strength for whatever lay ahead. No sooner had the words left my lips than the first sound erupted. Not a soft tap on the window, but a violent thud against the metal basement door. The world we had so carefully built was about to crumble. The door opened with a bang that shook the walls. It wasn't just a simple opening. It was a brutal assault, designed to intimidate, to sow fear in seconds. The first man to enter wore a dark green uniform bearing the symbol of the National Security Service. Behind him came 4 more agents, a black shadow that filled the small space with shouts and orders. "Get down, now!" There was no time to think. Rustam was the first to fall, slammed hard against the cold basement floor, and in that instant, everything changed. Dilbar gasped as a police officer grabbed her arm and shoved her alongside the others. I tried to stay on my feet, but a firm hand gripped my neck and slammed me to the ground. I tasted the bitter, metallic taste of blood in my mouth. The cold concrete pressed against my cheek, while the heavy weight of a boot dug between my shoulder blades. "Don't move, not a word," a cold voice ordered. The basement was in controlled chaos. The officers moved with the precision of those following a well-trained protocol, searching every corner as if nothing could escape their gaze. One of them snatched the Bible from Dilbar's hands and threw it into a cardboard box. Another collected the pamphlets we had brought that morning, stories of faith written in Uzbek. Everything was confiscated, handwritten hymnals, sermon notes, even the small wooden crosses some wore around their necks. Lying there on the floor, I watched my brothers' faces. Assista, the man who had overcome alcoholism, kept his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. Jamila, despite her illness, wept softly. Rustam stared at the stairs, perhaps thinking of his 3 children sleeping upstairs. A deep guilt pierced me like a sharp knife. I had put them in danger. The gray-mustachioed police officer, the same one who had interrogated me months earlier, entered the basement slowly, with deliberate steps. He wore a long black coat and leather gloves. He stopped right in front of me, knelt down until he was level with my face, and smiled. But it wasn't a smile of victory. It was cold, calculating. The smile of someone who already knew they'd won a game they'd been playing for a long time. "Murat," he said my name like a sentence. "Ah, you thought you could hide forever." I didn't respond. I knew any word could be used against me, but he didn't even expect an answer. He sat down and signaled to one of the younger officers who lifted me off the ground with a sharp jerk. My knees barely obeyed. I struggled to my feet as he circled us, like a hunter inspecting his prey. "Preaching without registration is a crime against the nation," he declared loudly for all to hear. "You are not martyrs, you are criminals. You are contaminating our people with a foreign ideology, eroding the values that have sustained our culture for centuries. Therefore, each of you will face the consequences." Dilbar gasped audibly. Rustam clenched his fists but remained silent. I kept my gaze fixed on the ground, feeling the cold of the handcuffs tightening around my wrists. The metal dug into my skin, tightening until I felt my wrist throb against the steel. The agent with the gray mustache stepped closer again, so close I could smell the strong scent of tobacco on his breath. "You are the leader," he whispered, loud enough for the others to hear. "You carry the greatest responsibility. The others are just lost sheep. But you are the wolf in sheep's clothing." I wanted to respond, to tell him he was wrong, that these people chose their faith freely, that I never forced anyone into anything. But the words stuck in my throat. In that moment, looking at them there on the ground, scared and helpless, I wondered if I was really right. I had led them this far, and now they were dragging me toward the stairs. Before climbing, I turned one last time to look at my brothers. It was then that Dilbar opened his eyes and held my gaze steadily. In that moment, despite the fear that enveloped us, I saw something unexpected. Not regret, but gratitude. Dilbar raised his hand slightly, in a gesture that seemed like a farewell or a blessing. Rustam nodded with conviction, as if silently saying, "You did the right thing." But those images faded as I was pushed upstairs. Outside, the biting December cold hit me like a slap in the face, and snow fell softly on the empty streets of Andijan. A black car, with no license plates, was waiting for me, its engine running and silent. I was thrown into the back seat, with 2 police officers sitting on either side, pressing me between their strong, cold bodies. The car drove off slowly, and through the fogged-up window I saw the streets I knew so well. The bakery where I bought bread every morning, the mosque with its blue minaret, the park where I sometimes retreated to pray in silence. Everything seemed strange now, as if I had left that world forever. Maybe I would never go back there. The drive lasted only 15 minutes, but for me it felt like an eternity. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the roar of the engine and the crunch of snow beneath the tires. Finally, the vehicle stopped in front of a gray concrete building with no visible windows. I recognized the place immediately, the National Security Service Detention Center, a place shrouded in whispered stories of people who came and went, transformed by fear, or simply never left. I was roughly dragged from the car, handcuffs tightened around my wrists with every movement. We climbed 3 steps and passed through a heavy steel door. The smell in the air was a mixture of damp, cheap disinfectant and something harder to define, a suffocating, accumulated despair. The hallways were narrow, lit by flickering fluorescent lights, casting unsettling shadows. In the distance, I heard muffled voices and screams coming from somewhere deep inside the building. They took me to a room for registration. A board officer wrote my name down in a thick book filled with old notes. They removed my belt, shoelaces, and watch. Everything was placed inside a clear plastic bag. "Sign here," the officer said, pointing to a piece of paper. I didn't read anything, just signed with a trembling hand. Then I was led down a darker, colder corridor. Rusted metal doors lined either side, each with a small, reinforced glass window. Some cells were empty. Others showed slowly moving shadows, human figures huddled in corners. Finally, we stopped at a door at the end of the corridor. The grey mustachioed officer, who had been with me since the arrest, took out a set of keys and unlocked the door with a metallic click. "Welcome to your new home," he said with the same cold, cruel smile. "I hope your God keeps you warm." The door opened, and what I saw chilled me more than the biting cold outside. It was a tiny cell, no bigger than a closet, barely big enough for a person lying diagonally across it. The walls were covered in a thick layer of frost, an ice that glistened in the dim light of a bulb hanging from the ceiling. The concrete floor was damp and slippery, a cold that seemed to penetrate to the bone. In a corner of the cell, I found a thin, soggy blanket and a piece of stale bread on a dented metal plate. I was shoved inside, and the door closed with a loud bang, the sound echoing in my bones. I heard the key turning in the lock and the sound of footsteps retreating until silence filled the room. The silence was absolute, heavy, and in that moment, I felt the weight of fear invade me in a way I had never felt before. The cell was freezing, and the cold began to penetrate my clothes, my skin, my flesh. I breathed deeply, but each breath seemed to tear my lungs. I looked around and realized this would be my reality for an indefinite period. The space was so cramped, so claustrophobic, that every movement seemed a challenge. The walls were covered in ice, the ceiling was low, and the space was only 2 meters long by 1 meter wide. If I stretched out my arms, I would touch both walls at once. The ceiling was so close to my head that, as I tried to stand up, I almost touched the hanging light bulb. It emitted a dim, yellowish light, flickering every few seconds, as if mocking me. That light illuminated nothing but my misery, as if constantly reminding me that I was alone in the darkness. The feeling of despair slowly took over, like the cold that enveloped me. It didn't come suddenly. It was a slow, calculated invasion, as if it had the power to destroy me from within. It started at my feet, crept up my legs, and spread through my chest. With every breath, I felt as if I were fighting something invisible. I sat on the floor because there was no other option. There was no room for anything else but the cold and emptiness of the cell. The blanket in the corner was damp and heavy. When I unfolded it, I noticed it was stained and smelled strongly of mildew, but it was the only comfort I had. I threw it over my shoulders and tried to hug it to my body, hoping to create some kind of warmth with my own breath. But the blanket seemed to absorb what little heat I had left, becoming another enemy. The bread on the metal plate was so hard that when I tried to break it, I could barely move it. When I finally bit into it, it tasted bitter and dry, like something that had already lost its life days or even weeks before. Even so, the emptiness in my stomach left me no choice, so I chewed slowly, feeling each bite scratch my throat. There was no water, and bread became a painful attempt to nourish a body that was growing weaker by the day. The ice on the walls was the only other food I could attempt to consume, but I knew it would only accelerate hypothermia, so I avoided it. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, searching for the words I had repeated so many times before, the Lord's Prayer, but my lips were so frozen I could barely move them. The words came out distorted, broken, as if someone else were trying to pray for me. "Who art in heaven?" My voice faltered, and the echo of my plea bounced off the icy walls, returning empty, unanswered. I was there, alone, my heart pounding, but somehow further from God than I had ever been. The cold seemed to have taken on a life of its own, invading every cell of my body, making me a prisoner not only of the cell, but of my own pain. Every breath was a struggle. I huddled even tighter, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to resist the despair. The biting cold made me think of things I'd never imagined before. But despite the terror and doubt, there was something inside me that refused to give in completely. Even in the deep silence of my prison, a small flame of hope still burned, but I could barely see it. I thought of my brothers down in the basement, under the hands of the same system that now held me there in that isolated cell. Had they endured the same fate as me? Would they have been tormented by the same icy loneliness and the same growing doubt? Or perhaps it would have been easier for them, since they didn't carry the weight of leadership, the responsibility of having guided everyone to that moment. Was this what tore me apart? The fear that I had led them to a dead end, an end devoid of meaning? My thoughts tangled together, a tangle of guilt, fears, and hopes, and with each passing moment, the doubt grew more intense. What would become of us? I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was the product of my mind. Crazed, at times I thought I heard voices, whispers, coming from the wall. Other times, it was footsteps echoing in my ears, approaching but never arriving, like a ghostly presence. I felt a growing pain in my chest. The air felt thick, and each breath was more labored than the last. The heat from my body felt like it was being sucked away as the cold took root deeper within me. My fingers no longer responded, and the sensation that my feet were petrified only grew. I was in a place where time seemed to stand still. I didn't know how much time had passed. Had I been there for days? Hours? Or an indefinite, torturous time that only heightened the feeling that time no longer existed for me? And then, in the back of my mind, the most painful doubt arose. What if this was all a lie? What if God had never been there, never guided me, never heard our prayers? The mere possibility of this paralyzed me, as if all the suffering, all the pain I had felt and caused, were without reason. I was there, alone, without an answer, and the void in my mind was filled only with the echo of absolute silence. "Where are you?" I whispered into the darkness, trying to find something to anchor me, something greater than the cold that enveloped me. But there was no answer. The darkness became an impenetrable wall to my faith. There was no sound, no presence, only the hum of the flickering lamp and the heavy silence that enveloped me ever more tightly. Night fell without me noticing, only the echoes of the changing of the guard in the corridor alerting me to the change. The new voices, the lighter footsteps, broke the stillness for a moment, but soon receded, leaving me alone again in the abyss of my cell. The only remaining light was the dim lamp above me, my only companion in that profound darkness. I lay on the floor, unable to get up, feeling my body tremble uncontrollably, as if it were my last resistance against the slow, painful death I knew was approaching. And yet, deep down, one question kept hammering away. If I were able to survive this, what would be left of me? I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, a numbness washed over me, a strange feeling of being disconnected from my body. It was as if I were floating above myself, watching that frail man prostrate on the cold floor of the cell. I felt life slowly slipping away, not quickly, but with a frightening calm. It was as if every part of me was being disconnected, one cell at a time, surrendering to the cold that enveloped me. My thoughts became hazy, difficult to organize. Words fell apart, and all I could say were fragments. Please help me. Don't leave me. I braced myself for the end, thinking the darkness would finally overtake me. When I no longer had the strength to even tremble, when my breath was barely moving, something surprising happened. At first I thought it was a hallucination, a sound so subtle it could have been the wind trying to seep through a crack. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a song, something that made no sense, but it was there, filling the void around me. The voice was soft, almost imperceptible. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have dismissed it as a distant whisper, but the silence and cold made everything clearer. I opened my eyes, but the cell was the same. The icy walls, the flickering light, the solitude. But the song persisted. It was then that the melody began to grow clearer. It wasn't coming from the corridor, nor from the neighboring cells. It seemed to emerge from the air itself, as if the frozen molecules in the air had organized themselves to sing. I raised my head with effort, feeling my muscles rebel against the movement, but the sound called to me. I tried to locate its source, but it was useless. The music was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Then I recognized the melody. My heart, already beating weakly, leaped. It was a hymn we sang in our secret meetings, one Dilbar had always loved. The words of Psalm 27 echoed in my mind. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? The singing didn't sound human, but something more. It was pure, without the mistakes and flaws we all carry when we sing. There were no gasps, no hesitations, no off-key notes. It was like hearing crystal-clear water flowing gently over smooth stones, like the first ray of sunlight touching the earth after a dark night. And though the song was in Uzbek, the words sounded clear and perfect, as if the language itself had been purified. With tears beginning to fall, I leaned against the cold wall of the cell, momentarily forgetting the consuming cold. The singing filled the space, not thunderously, but so powerfully that it felt like the cell itself was expanding. The walls seemed to recede, and the ceiling rose, as if the space were expanding before me. I looked up, hoping to see something, some explanation, but all I saw was cracked concrete and the lone light bulb. The Lord is my light and my salvation. The words filled every corner of the cell. I closed my eyes again, not out of exhaustion, but out of something much deeper. It was a surrender, but not the surrender of someone who gives up. It was the surrender of someone who finally stops fighting the current and lets themselves be carried away. Tears burned my frozen face, an unexpected warmth amidst the immense cold. It was at that moment, as I surrendered myself to this heavenly sound, that something extraordinary happened. The cold began to recede, but not all at once, but gradually, as if an invisible hand were lifting a heavy blanket from me. First, I felt my fingers tingle, that sharp pain that arises when blood begins to return to numb limbs. Then, the heat slowly crept down my legs until it reached my chest. The ice on the walls was still there, glistening in the yellow light, but it no longer threatened me. It no longer held power over me. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in hours, felt my lungs fill without pain. The air that entered was no longer sharp, like knives, but soft, almost warm. I looked at my hands and realized they were trembling, not from the cold, but from something else entirely, an energy that wasn't coming from me, but was being given to me. The chant continued, soft, rising and falling in waves. The melodic notes seemed to follow the rhythm of my own heart. Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? With each repetition of that question, the fear I had carried for so long began to dissolve. Not just the fear of those endless hours in that cell, but the fear that had accompanied me through every secret meeting, every interrogation, every sleepless night. The fear began to fade, as if being carried away by an invisible wind. And then something else happened. A scent reached me, faint but distinct. At first I thought it was another hallucination, but I soon realized it wasn't. It was real and very specific. The smell of burning wood, like a roaring fireplace in winter. That rich, comforting fragrance filled the cell, so intensely I could almost taste it. There was no fire there, no wood, just concrete, ice, and the damp blanket. But the smell was unmistakable. I stood up easily, as if my legs had never been so weak. The blanket fell from my shoulders, but I no longer needed it. A soft, inexplicable warmth enveloped me. Not the suffocating heat of a fever, but something deep, welcoming, like the embrace of someone who loved me without restraint. I raised my hands toward the ceiling, toward the sound that filled me, as if searching for the invisible source of this presence. The words left my mouth without thinking. You are here. Are you here with me? It wasn't a question, but an absolute certainty, something that pierced my very being. For the first time since being thrown into that cell, I knew with all my soul that I wasn't alone. The chant reached its climax, not in volume, but in emotional intensity. It was as if 1,000 voices had joined the first, creating a harmony so complex and beautiful that my mind couldn't keep up. I could only feel. Let this music flow through me and transform me. I fell to my knees, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had become irrelevant. It could have been minutes or hours, but in that space between reality and something much greater, the clock stopped. There was only the singing, the comforting warmth, the scent of burning wood, and a profound peace that filled me, enveloping me in a way that couldn't be explained by human logic. When the chanting began to fade, it wasn't abrupt. It was like watching the sunrise in reverse, the light gently receding until only darkness remained. But now, the darkness didn't frighten me. It was full of promise, something planted that, in time, would grow. When I finally opened my eyes, the cell was exactly as it had been before. The walls were still covered in ice, the lamp still flickering, the blanket still wet on the floor. But I wasn't the same. Something had changed inside me, something that couldn't be erased, something that would stay with me forever. Something fundamental had shifted within me. The fear was still there, like a small, insignificant shadow trapped in some distant corner of my mind. But now, it no longer controlled me. I had experienced something that no human authority, no earthly power could take away from me, something that no one could erase from me, even if they wanted to. I sat in the center of the cell, enveloped by that inexplicable warmth that continued to pulsate like an echo of the encounter that transformed everything. I smiled, a smile that emerged effortlessly, straight from a deep place I hadn't even known existed, a smile of peace amidst suffering, injustice, pain, and uncertainty. I understood something essential in that moment. It didn't matter what happened from then on. They could no longer touch what truly mattered. My soul was safe, because it had been touched by something that could not be stolen. I closed my eyes again, and this time, as I began to pray, the words flowed clear and crystal clear. Thank you. Thank you for not abandoning me. Thank you for reminding me who you are and who I am in you. These words came from a place of pure gratitude, a deep recognition that while the circumstances around me were still beyond my control, I was no longer lost. I lay down on the floor, using the damp blanket, but not out of necessity. It was an automatic gesture, like a reflex of habit, of something I had done so many times before. But now, unlike before, the warmth that enveloped me didn't come from frustration, fear, or the need to survive. It was something deeper, safer, like a protective cocoon. My muscles relaxed, and my breathing became deeper, more regular. For the first time in an eternity that seemed to stretch into days or months, I felt I could rest. Not because external circumstances had changed, but because I had. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Distant voices, the metallic sound of keys clanging together. The door opened with a familiar click, and the light from the hallway cut through the gloom surrounding me. 2 guards stood at the door, watching me. Their expressions were hard to read, but one thing was clear: surprise, perhaps even confusion. One of the guards, the younger one with a scar marking his cheek, stepped forward and looked me up and down suspiciously. "How are you?" he murmured, a thread of disbelief in his voice. "Last night, I checked this cell. It was frozen." The other guard, older and with a face lined with years of experience in this dark place, frowned. He approached me cautiously, touching my forehead, as if to check if I was still human. When his fingers touched my skin, he pulled away quickly, as if he'd touched something incandescent. "It's hot," he said, almost a whisper, his voice low and filled with amazement. Impossible. Last night, this cell was freezing. I stood there before them, feeling that inner heat still pulsing in my chest. I looked into their eyes, not with challenge, but with a calm I'd never known I possessed. The young guard took a step back, clearly uncomfortable. The older guard remained still, studying me as if faced with something he couldn't comprehend. Then finally he spoke, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fascination. "What are you?" I smiled again, in no rush to answer. "Just a man who knows a song that can't be silenced." They exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances, and without another word, they abruptly closed the door. I heard their footsteps retreating quickly down the hallway, their voices whispering something I couldn't make out. But it didn't matter. I knew what they'd seen. They'd seen enough. I sat against the wall, hugging my knees, and then I waited, not with anxiety or fear, but with a calm that had previously seemed impossible, because now I knew, no matter what happened, no matter how long I spent there, or what tortures I faced next, there was something inside me that no wall could contain, something that would not dissipate, would not be extinguished. What I had now was greater than any suffering they could inflict on me. I was safe. The chanting had ceased, but its echo continued to reverberate within me, and I knew that echo would be enough for what was to come. The days dragged on, turning into weeks and then months. I lost track of time after the 15th day, when they stopped bringing me stale bread, the only marker of the time that remained. But something had changed since that night of chanting. The cold was still present, and though I still felt it on my skin, like a constant bite, there was something deeper, more vital, that kept me going. There was no longer the sensation of being consumed by it. The cold no longer dominated my body, because something inside me, something that could not be touched or torn away, was burning with a force that no temperature could extinguish. The interrogations began on the 3rd day. They took me from my cell at random times, morning, middle of the night, or at any moment. They were taking me to a room in Scan on the 2nd floor, a room larger than my cell, but just as suffocating. There was a metal table in the center, 2 chairs, a wooden cabinet, and a pendant lamp that emitted a harsh white light. The walls were an institutional green, dirty and stained, as if the place itself were oppressed by humidity and hopelessness, and there was always the agent with the gray mustache. He sat across from me, holding a folder full of documents, photographs, and reports. He opened the folder with slow, almost ritualistic movements, as if it were a dance he had perfected over the years. Murat always started the same way, pronouncing my name as if it were an accusation. "Today, we are going to talk about truths." He knew his words were meant to make me nervous, but I was no longer afraid. He showed me the photos again. Blurry images of my brothers entering the houses where we met. Blurry close-ups of faces I knew well. Yamila with her shopping bag. Rustam with tools in his hands. Dilbar walking down the street, a book under his arm. He looked directly at me with a cruel smile and said, "This is evidence of organized illegal activity." And then, with an almost theatrical glide, he spread the photos out on the table. "But you can protect them. I just need names." With each refusal, Murat's tone changed. His questions turned into accusations. "You are poisoning our youth with foreign ideology." He stared at me, waiting for a reaction. "How much money do you get paid? Who trains you?" No matter how much I explained that there was no money involved, that we were just a group of people trying to live our faith, he wouldn't listen. His eyes were closed to the truth. The interrogation stretched on for hours, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, and I was forced to stand, always standing, forbidden to sit. When my knees began to give way, one of the guards would push me away with a harsh order. Straighten up. The white light from the lamp burned my eyes, turning everything around me into blurry blurs. They stopped offering me water, trying to break my thirst. But every time I felt myself about to collapse, I remembered the song. I closed my eyes and heard it in my mind, those impossible notes, as if the air itself vibrated with them. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Of whom shall I be afraid? These words sustained me, gave me strength, and so I remained silent. I refused to betray what I loved. On the 10th day, they brought documents. They were official forms, printed on National Security Service letterhead. Murat held them out in front of me. With a smile he tried to make appear fatherly. "Sign here," he said. His voice held a tone of false care, as if he were offering me a chance to escape the suffering. But I knew what he wanted. He wanted to break me. He wanted me to betray the others. But something inside me was stronger than the pain. I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. But one thing was certain. Whatever happened from now on, I wasn't alone. I had something bigger holding me up, and that was all I needed to keep going. The officer placed the papers on the table and spoke in that measured tone that had become familiar. "Read carefully, Murat. This is your declaration of resignation. All you have to do is sign it. Promise to stop these illegal religious gatherings, and you can go home tomorrow. It's all here." I picked up the papers with trembling hands. The cold and fatigue made it difficult to even hold the page. I began to read, and each line seemed to weigh more than the last. I, Murat Karimov, acknowledge having participated in extremist religious activities without state authorization. I voluntarily renounce my Christian faith and promise not to further engage in any unregistered worship group. The pen was already there, waiting. All I had to do was pick it up, cross out my name at the end of that lie, and in 3 seconds I'd be free. I could walk the streets of Andijan again, breathe fresh air, eat real food, sleep in a bed. I lifted the pen and held it over the dotted line. Across the table, the gray mustachioed agent leaned forward, certain he'd won. But in that moment, my mind was filled with faces and stories. I thought of Asi, who overcame her alcohol addiction after finding peace in our meetings. Of Dilbar, crying during prayer because she had finally felt accepted there. I thought of Rustam, who with 3 young children still opened his home every week to us for meetings, even knowing the risk. And then I just dropped the pen. The metallic sound of the impact on the table echoed loudly, like a protest coming from the depths of my soul. "I can't sign this," I said. My voice was weak but firm. "I can't deny who I am." The agent's smile instantly disappeared. His face darkened. He stood up with suppressed anger, grabbed the documents and tossed them aside. "Idiot," he said through gritted teeth. "You're going to regret this." And he was right. What came next was harder than the cold of the cell. They returned me to the same prison, but now guards would come in at all hours, banging on the walls with iron bars just to keep me from resting. Food was now served only every other day. The cell light, which had previously flickered, now stayed on constant. That lamp became a form of silent torture, robbing me of sleep, my sanity. There were nights when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. My body was deteriorating. I could count my ribs on one hand. And yet, when doubt knocked on my heart's door, there was something that sustained me. The song. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" That kept me going. It wasn't just a song. It was a living memory of God's presence with me in that place, something no one could take away. 3 months passed, or more, I don't know, until one morning, the officer with the gray mustache appeared in my cell. But this time, he wasn't carrying indictment papers. They were release papers. "The state has decided to grant you clemency," he said coldly. "You will be released, but you will continue to be monitored. Any suspicious behavior, and you will be returned here, immediately." He handed me back a small bag containing my belongings, a belt, shoelaces, and my watch, which hadn't kept time in a while. "Go away," he murmured, "before we change our minds." I walked through the gates of the detention center in broad daylight. The March sun beat down on my face with a force I'd forgotten. It was as if the sky had touched me. The wind smelled of dust, of baked bread, of freedom. I returned to Andijan. I looked for my brothers. Rustam's house was chained shut. Neighbors said he had fled to Kazakhstan with his family. Dilbar's apartment was empty. A for rent sign hung in the window. Yamila had disappeared without a trace. The pain of this loss was profound, but there was something no one had been able to touch: my faith. The congregation had disbanded. Some fled the country, others disappeared without a trace, afraid of being recognized. That night, alone in a rented room smelling of tobacco and peeling walls, I seriously considered leaving, crossing the border into Kazakhstan, perhaps further to some place where following Jesus wouldn't be a crime. I closed my eyes and prayed, hoping to hear only the sound of the wind outside. But what came wasn't the otherworldly chanting of the cell. It was something simpler, more intimate, a deep conviction that whispered within me, "Stay. There is still work to be done here." I opened my eyes and saw the lights of Andijan flickering in the distance. I knew then that I couldn't run. If we all left, who would be left to care for those still lost? And so I stayed. Years have passed since that night in the freezing cell, and over time I learned to move like a shadow through the cities of Uzbekistan, bringing hope to those who still silently believed. I have no fixed home. My address changes constantly. Sometimes I sleep on borrowed sofas, other times on thin mattresses left by brothers who trust me only because they heard of a pastor who survived the impossible. I serve churches that still breathe in hiding. In Tashkent, I meet with 12 people in a forgotten industrial basement. In Samarkand, I visit a family who transformed their garage into a small temple. In Bukhara, young university students meet with me at midnight, behind closed curtains, to study the Word. Each city has its own small flock, each face a story of faith and resilience. I've become something I never planned to be, a spiritual pilgrim, a man with no visible roots but a steadfast purpose, sowing courage where there's fear, rekindling the flame where the cold tries to extinguish hope. The authorities know I exist. My name is in records, my face in files. Still, I've learned to recognize the signs of danger and disappear when necessary. But there's a ritual I maintain, especially when winter arrives and the air fills with snow. I find a quiet place, an empty room, a forgotten alley, and close my eyes. I return in my thoughts to that cell. I feel again the ice on the walls, the damp blanket, the slow pain of life fading away. And then I hear the music, the same impossible melody that once filled that tiny space, transforming it into a cathedral. That voice that came not from any man, but from the Creator himself, reminding me that he was there, even in the hell of fear. The guards never heard that music. When they opened the door, they saw only a man standing, smiling, in a place that should have destroyed him. I never told them what happened. They wouldn't understand. Maybe they'd say it was a hallucination, that the cold made me delirious. But I know what I experienced. It was real as the air I breathe now, as the ground that supports my steps, as the tears that still flow when I remember. Because that song didn't just keep me alive, it transformed me. And it revealed to me the truth that no interrogation, threat, or document could erase. Neither the coldest walls, nor the cruelest regimes, nor the darkest prisons can contain the presence of God. They can take away your freedom. They can rob you of your dignity, your comfort, even tear you away from everyone you love. They can weaken your body until every movement feels like a battle. But there's something no one can touch, what you choose to keep inside. I told my story to only a few. One of them was Arman, a young pastor from Fergana, who had given up his ministry after receiving threats from the authorities. I spoke about the cell, the cold, the song that found me when nothing else made sense. I told him that true faith isn't a compromise with fear, it's a decision. When I finished, I saw something change in his eyes. 2 weeks later, I received a short message. "I'll stay. Someone has to stay." Maybe you've been there too. That moment when everyone leaves and you have to decide whether to stay or run. Or maybe you're right there right now, wondering if it's still worth fighting, if there's still purpose in the midst of suffering. If that's you, tell me your story. Write it down. Someone needs to read what you've experienced to find courage in the desert. I also spoke with Nagora, a woman who lost her husband in prison for preaching without permission. She was overcome with grief, trying to understand why God had allowed. When I shared my experience with her, she wept for a long time and then said, "My husband heard something. He never told me what it was, but now I understand. That's what sustained him." And that's why I'm telling you all this now. Perhaps for you, who listen or read me and feel like you're inside a cell. Maybe your prison doesn't have bars or ice walls. Maybe it's an illness that limits you, a loss that still bleeds, a fear that paralyzes you every morning. Maybe it's God's silence that seems never-ending. Whatever your cell, write, share it so I can pray for you. But above all, know this. The same God who sent a song to a freezing cell in Uzbekistan is the same God who can reach you wherever you are. He doesn't always come as we expect. He doesn't always arrive with immediate deliverance or easy answers. Sometimes, he comes as a whisper only your heart hears, as a gentle warmth in the midst of the cold, as a peace that defies all logic. And if you've ever experienced something like this, that inexplicable moment when the impossible seemed to give way, when you felt you weren't alone, please share it too. Not for me, but for others who need to know they're not imagining it, that they're not crazy, that this presence is real. Sometimes the first step to starting over is simply discovering that someone, somewhere, also survived their own cell. And if you haven't experienced this encounter yet, if your prison still seems cold and silent, don't give up. I doubted too. I thought God had gone silent, but it was right there, at the darkest point of my story, that He answered. It wasn't doors opening or chains breaking. It was something much deeper, something that changed not just what I saw, but who I was. It was in that freezing cell that God reminded me of who He is and who I am. He showed me that my identity doesn't depend on the bars that surround me or the documents they force me to sign. My true identity is rooted in a connection that no regime can sever, that no prison can erase. And now, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening to me? From what corner? What city? What reality? Because from Uzbekistan to there, where you are now, there is something greater than borders that unites us. Today, I continue to live in the shadows here. I continue to take risks every time I enter a basement to pray with my brothers, or when we knock on the door of a garage that has become a secret church. The cell may still await me, or worse, but fear no longer rules me as it once did. Because I've learned one thing. There is something stronger than fear. There is a song that all of hell cannot silence. If this story touched something inside you, if it sparked hope, if it reminded you of something you'd forgotten, then listen to that voice that might be whispering inside you right now. The voice that says, there is still hope. There is still purpose. It's still worth getting up tomorrow. And if you feel the need to act, to do something with what you heard, share this story. It's that simple. Sometimes, what you share is the song someone else needs to hear in the midst of their own silence. Every time this story reaches someone, it's like lighting a candle in the darkness. It's an act of spiritual resistance. It's saying to the world, darkness does not have the last word. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, real stories of faith in places where being a Christian still costs everything, subscribe. Your support helps these voices the world tries to drown out, reach those who need to hear them most. And I close with the same words I heard that night, when all seemed lost. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Of whom shall I be afraid? May you find your own answer to this question, that when your darkest night comes, you too may hear your song. And may you never, ever forget, not even the coldest walls can contain the presence of God. Thank you for walking with me this far. If this was helpful to you, the best way to honor this story is to live it. Be a light in your own cell. Be a song in someone else's silence. There is a sound I will never forget. It wasn't the sound of guards' boots or shouts in the hallways. It was the sound of a song, soft, impossible, that filled a cell where no human voice should enter. But that part comes later. Because to understand everything, you first need to know how I got there. My name is Murat, and for years I was a shepherd in the city of Andijan, in eastern Uzbekistan, where summer burns the skin and winter cuts like a blade, where being Christian is seen as a betrayal of the state, of tradition, of our identity as a people. We lived in hiding. Our church had no sign, no temple, no bell. There were 15 of us. We met in kitchens, basements, borrowed apartments. Shamila, with her cotton-marked hands, welcomed us on Tuesdays. Rustam, with his 3 sons, opened his cellar on Thursdays. And Dilbar, the math teacher, let us into his apartment on Sundays. as long as we left before sunrise. This is the true story of a church alive in the midst of persecution, and this is just the beginning.